Dear viewer, if you were to read the Old Testament from the book of Genesis all the way through the end of 2 Kings, you'd be reading Israel's basic national story, its basic historical epic, from the creation of the world all the way through David and Solomon and the monarchy until the fall of the monarchy and the destruction of the nation. Readers of this literature have often asked a very crucial question, and if you've asked it too, you are not alone and you are not crazy. And that question would go something like this: what did I just read, and was that all made up? Fiction? Or did that actually happen in history, as history? Were these kings and prophets and people real people? Were they not real people? And I mean, you could read Genesis and maybe be like, yeah, I see that there's a storytelling tradition here. It's creation. It's mystical. It can't really be thought of in that genre of history. But once you get into the Exodus, you start to ask the question a little harder, because they're mentioning the names of all kinds of people and places in Egypt, which was a big empire at the time. And then you go into this, the conquest of the land in Joshua and Judges, and you think, well, there must be some archaeological evidence of that if that happened. And by the time you get into Samuel, and really the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, you're reading the names of all these kings. You're seeing allusions to historical sources where the narrator says things like, well, if you want to read more about this king, is it not written in the books of the annals of the kings of Israel or Judah or something like that? And so you're asking yourself, what is the claim to history here in this content that I'm reading? Is there any evidence that Israel as a nation or any of these characters existed as characters outside the Bible? And you really want to be careful to ask outside the Bible. Why? Because as an historical principle, you wouldn't just read one text, which in its physical copies that we have is nowhere near contemporaneous with the material it describes, and just proclaim something to be history, that genre of history. It's worth a whole separate video just to talk about what we mean when we say history, because definitions, at least on the academic scene over the past few decades, have ranged anywhere from what we mean by history is essentially like what happened. Like if you were here with a camera, you could have caught it on camera, the person saying the thing, it's what happened, all the way to something like there's no such thing as history, there is memory and there is story, right? We have tellings and we have narrative, and there's no such thing as just what happened, but there is rather memory and what we say happened. And those are two very different definitions even of history right there, and they both have their place within historiographic discourse. But okay, my point is already, we're 3 minutes into this, there's a lot going on here when we ask this question. But we have to ask it. I mean, the earliest texts of the Old Testament, I'm just sticking with the Old Testament here, that we have are, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls. When are they from? Maybe the earliest Dead Sea Scrolls. Some people have dated some of the manuscripts on paleographic or epigraphic grounds on the basis of the writing to maybe 200 or even 250 BCE in the case of the 4 Samuel scrolls, the most conservative dating. But most of them seem like they were copied by the community that was living there around 150, 100, 0, something like that. So, when did the Exodus putatively happen? Well, the early date for the Exodus used to be maybe sometime in the 1500s or 1400s or something like that. The more updated date for those who see it as historical would be sometime in the 1200s BCE. So you're talking about a 1,000-year gap. And I know when we talk about ancient history, it's like, what's 1,000 years between friends? Well, 1,000 years is a very, very long time, okay, to talk about the distance between an event and its narration. If the earliest version of a text you have is from like 200 BC and the event happened in 1200 BC, okay? Is the Bible, as you read it, the Hebrew Bible, is it a kind of a snow globe, this kind of enclosed fantasy world, a completely fake world fabricated by authors maybe who were living in the 400s BC or the 300s BC, maybe even some of them in the 200s or the 100s BC, and they essentially reverse engineered this entire world of ancient Israel as an ideological construction, kind of projecting it back and giving themselves a history that they never actually had, based maybe on some oral traditions and some scanty memories of names and things, but really nothing else. This is the question then that we're asking. All right, it took me too long just to get to that question, but here we are. Okay. Now the form that this took, the form that this debate has taken, there's no way I can summarize it here, but we can maybe dive into elements of it at least and get at least a beginner's or a kind of a starter kit, let's say, for handling this question and for thinking about it in a responsible, basic, normal human kind of way. For me, that also includes thinking about it in a Christian way, but a Christian reading of the Bible is not only a strictly historical reading, nor is a Christian reading merely claiming that everything that's narrated as prose in the Bible is the genre of history. This is a very, very tough thing for some people to hear and to get on board with, but I think the only appeal I can make here, I have another video here called like, should anybody use the word inerrancy to describe their view of the Bible, where I review a book by John Walton, who's would be seen as by a lot of people as a very conservative Christian author. He uses the word inerrancy to describe the Bible, very traditional, almost like fundamentalist style language. He states very clearly that he does not believe that everything that is narrated in prose in the Bible should be treated as the contemporary genre of history, okay? So this is something we got to kind of get our minds around. This is not like mean scholar man, atheist attacking the Bible. Far from it in my case, and certainly far from it in the case of John Walton, okay? So the form that this has taken, the forms that this debate have taken have just been so numerous that I can't possibly summarize. What I can offer are a few sort of tips for thinking about how you might begin to wrap your mind around a question like that. Okay. When I first became aware of this debate, at least as a budding scholar, really in maybe my master's program or really well into my PhD program, probably in some ways, which I started in 2006, we were coming hot off the heels of what people used to refer to as the minimalist-maximalist debate. The minimalist and the maximalist. The minimalist historians of ancient Israel came on the scene and wanted to say, look, we cannot assume anything is history unless it is proven by multiple sources outside the Bible. You cannot trust the Bible to just narrate things and just be historically accurate. So it introduced a skepticism, in some cases even, at least as the accusations went, a radical skepticism about the historicity of ancient Israel. Nothing's real unless it could be proven in particular ways, and probably we can't even prove most of the things, and therefore most of it isn't real. The book that kicked this off in some ways was a classic. It's a great book. As always, links to all of these books and things I'm talking about down below in the show notes. This book by Philip Davies, In Search of Ancient Israel. There was a new edition of it here, so 2 editions of the same book, In Search of Ancient Israel. Let me give you a sampling of the kinds of things that someone like Davies might say. Even on this page I just randomly opened to, something I have underlined. He's talking about a particular biblical event, and he said, "Let us remind ourselves that the only evidence for this event is the biblical story itself." Okay, that's worth noting. Here on another page, he says, look, what is ancient Israel? The fact is then, and this is the quote, that our ancient Israel is not the biblical literary entity, nor a historical one. It is a scholarly creation deemed essential to the pursuit of biblical studies, and it has come about by the simple but erroneous step of lifting one kind of thing out of a text and setting it down somewhere else. It owes nearly everything to Bible reading, nothing to critical reflection, and very little indeed to historical research. So this is the kind of agenda then that he set out. So it meant, and he would ask questions, reasonable questions like, do we have any more evidence to say that King David was even a real historical character at all, more than we have to say Abraham was a historical character, or Adam and Eve? Just the fact that they're narrated in the Bible, is that the evidence? So I think this was published first in 1992. So it kind of tells you the 1990s were like the heyday of this, and really this book was very, very influential in kicking that off. Other books, more contemporary books. Mario Liverani, an Italian scholar, Israel's History and the History of Israel. Another great book, considered a classic history in the field. I mean, right in the title of the book itself, Liverani gives his pitch. I love a book that just tells the whole story by the title. He's like, look, there is Israel's history, which is the story in the Bible, and then there's the history of Israel, and those are two different things. So right there you get the argument. Then of course, you had people rise up then to defend the Bible and to defend what we might know about the historicity of the Bible based on archaeology, based on inscriptions, and based on a lot of just good historical work. One of the most fiery, fierce of these types was a guy named William Dever. I mean, this book was a classic rebuttal of the minimalist position. So if you want to check that out, this would be a book that you'd want to check out. What did the biblical writers know and when did they know it? What archaeology can tell us about the reality of ancient Israel? It's a very impressive book. He really, really takes them to task. He's certainly not any kind of deep conservative evangelical Christian, Bill Dever. I don't think he's a Christian at all, actually. But he's a traditional biblical archaeologist who looks at this and says, no, archaeology has to say something, and archaeology is going to have something to say. We'll get into this in a little bit. I mean, of course, we have this issue of texts, and then also archaeology, written things, and then also physical remains that are not writing. I'll focus on a couple of textual things by way of answering this question, did Israel exist outside of the Bible in the ancient world, which is really maybe something we can address here. Some other books to look at. I mean, this was an older classic. This is the third edition of John Bright's A History of Israel. The criticism of these kinds of books was that basically, how were they different from just reading the Bible itself? They basically just repeated the narrative of the Bible itself, maybe with a couple of interpretive pieces or an archaeological artifact here and there. But they basically, the accusation went, they just took the Bible too seriously as an historical source and essentially just repeated the Bible, which is not exactly historical method, they argued. This was probably one of the better histories of Israel from the conservative position that was very sophisticated on a methodological or theoretical ground, and also was a good integration of text and of archaeology and of interpretation. It's called The Biblical History of Israel by Pravon, Long, and Longman. This, I think, was published in 2003. There may be some more recent things that have been written too, but these were things I could pull off the shelf and that I at least have read. They made kind of the strongest case, all three of them from a deeply Christian position, that in fact, some of this extreme skepticism we should be skeptical of the skepticism. We should doubt the doubt and have reasons for doing so. In archaeology, in our reading of a text. They actually proposed something that was really fascinating, and you could debate what kind of approach you want to take. Whereas, I'm getting my book back out here, whereas someone like Dever might have said, we should take a basic stance of skepticism toward texts, especially toward ancient texts. Pravon, Long, and Longman said, no, we should take a stance of trust toward texts, because all texts are, in a sense, a form of testimony. So some of it really will depend on the starting place that you take. I mean, we can't deny the role of bias in either of these authors or the starting place from which they launched their journey. So I'm at least giving you some resources here that if you wanted to do further reading and really get into this, that's not a bad starter kit of books you could kind of read back and forth and get a sense in the specifics for how the argument played out. Okay. What I really wanted to do, though, that was 14 minutes of introduction just to get you to the place where you'd feel amped up to see some pictures. And I'm going to use a very low-tech system here. This is not exemplary YouTubing, I do realize, but I'll have links to all this below where you can see the actual pictures in a little better definition. I want to show you a series of images that will at least give you a sense for how we might know that Israel or any biblical character existed even if we didn't even have the Bible. What would we actually know? Some of you might be impressed with how much we do know, and some of you might be very disappointed with how little we do know. And of course, we always want to know more. What about the existence of Israel? What is the earliest physical evidence we have for just the name or the word Israel? I'll show you two artifacts. This first one, sometimes called the Berlin statue pedestal relief, The date of this thing is disputed. The date is disputed because it is unprovenanced, which is archaeological lingo for meaning we don't know where it came from. It seems to be authentic. The date is disputed, maybe as early as the 1500s, 1400s BCE, maybe as late as the 1200s. And the idea here is that maybe the word Israel is actually written on this relief. The reading is disputed. Everything about this thing is disputed. I hesitate to even bring it up. But some people do see it as an authentic example of the name Israel. And it seems to correspond with some of the earliest references we actually have in writing in Egyptian documents to the name of Israel's God, Israel's specific deity, Yahweh, Yod-He, Vav-He in Hebrew, the Tetragrammaton, translated in Bibles as the Lord in all capital letters. And they describe this deity as being a deity up in the desert region, kind of south of where we know Israel is today. So these would be, if that artifact was real, it would correspond to some of these earliest references to Israel's God, the Lord or Yahweh, in maybe the 1300s, maybe the 1200s. Now, speaking of the 1200s, we also have this thing called the Merneptah stele. This is an undisputed document. It's from about the year 1205. And it is, so this is all, you can't really see it here, but this whole wall on this whole wall of this whole front side of the stela, or this big stone slab, which is like, pretty high, is hieroglyphics. And in these hieroglyphics, you have this pharaoh, Merneptah, bragging about all kinds of things, the people he has defeated, the things he has done. And one of the peoples he brags about engaging in warfare is a group he calls Israel. And this is the first really, I think, pretty much undisputed reference to Israel. Again, it comes from about, I said 1205, it might even be from like 1220 BCE. It's in the Egypt Museum in Cairo. You can see it. And I mean, what does this tell us? Does this tell us that the Exodus was historical or any biblical story? No, of course not. It's a reference, though, and it tells us that even the name Israel, or the idea that there was a group living in this place called Israel, cannot merely have been invented hundreds and hundreds of years after the year 1200 as some convenient fiction. The Egyptians were calling them Israel. They must have been called Israel, right? And maybe they didn't just show up there like 5 minutes before Merneptah did his campaign and wrote his stela about them, but rather this was an established group. Might not have been a very big group, but it was a group. There's no contradiction there with the biblical record. Israel in this period would have been a recently arrived Exodus group, maybe in the period of the Judges. I mean, it gets a little murky, right, at this point. But you do have that. What kind of writing do we have from ancient Israel itself that's not in the Bible? Well, we have very little. I'll show you, and again, I'll put an article down here by Chris Rollston, who's one of the best scholars of this early writing system within the boundaries of what we might call Israel, so you can read this for yourself. But I'll show you what are the 4 contenders for the earliest writing that we might even call Hebrew writing. Of course, as you'll see if you read the article, Rollston doesn't think any of these things I'm about to show you are actually Hebrew, but they have been contenders, and other scholars disagree and think they might be examples of early Hebrew writing. Okay, first, how about this thing? Beautiful little inscription. It's about the size of the palm of your hand. It's called the Gezer Calendar. It's called the calendar because it's a little poem about agriculture. 2 months of harvesting, 2 months of sowing, 2 months of late planting, 1 month cutting flax, 1 month of this, and so on. And it even has the scribe's name, Aviyah, at the bottom of the artifact. So some people think this maybe is the earliest example of something we could call Hebrew writing. It's from around maybe the year 1000 BC, the year 950 BC, something like that. This would be, at least on a maximalist telling, something like the time of David and Solomon. So do we have evidence that people were actually writing, the kind of people who could actually write something like a narrative about somebody like David and Solomon around the year 1000? Yeah, we do. I mean, that's not a lot of evidence. That's not super impressive, and that's kind of that's as strong of a text as we have in Hebrew, or something like Hebrew from this time period. But we do have it. We also have, from around the same time period, this artifact here. This is called the Tel Zayit abecedary. What's an abecedary? It's an alphabet. So somebody on this rock wrote out the Hebrew alphabet. the Hebrew alphabet. You can click on the image of this down below, and you can see that you can recognize even maybe some of the letters even today. Like the very first letter in the upper right-hand corner kind of looks like the letter A on its side. That's because that's where we get our letter A, mediated through the Greek alphabet and through the Roman alphabet, right? It was essentially originally a Canaanite alphabet, which Israel used. So we have that. I mean, you know, somebody scrawling an alphabet on the side of a rock doesn't exactly mean they're writing a full-blown, you know, Book of Kings at that time, but it is at least someone writing, and it might have even been some kind of scribal practice that shows that people were cultivating this act of writing. This next text is very fascinating. It's called, people refer to it as the Qeiyafa ostracon because it was found at this place called Qeiyafa. It's this little document right here. There's a photo of it and then a drawing. What is this Qeiyafa ostracon? Well, it's a little piece of broken pottery with some letters on it. You can see them here. They seem to go in all kinds of different directions. And we don't really know what this text says. We just don't know. Some people have claimed a decipherment. We can tell what the letters are, sort of, but it's tough. Okay, it's tough. Another contender for an early inscription from this same time period, maybe 1000, maybe 900 BC, these dates are estimates, is this thing called the Izbet Sarta inscription down here. Izbet Sarta. This inscription might be another, abecedary, some people think. Some people think that this inscription is just a random agglutination of letters just written all over the place by somebody who was practicing writing, okay? Now, so take stock. Is this the kind of evidence we'd want to see? Does any of this suggest that early Israel was in the land, or that Solomon is historical, or David, or any of that stuff? No, of course not. I don't think anybody's really claiming that. I think the biggest claim people could make from documents like this is like something like this. Look, don't say that no one could have written a text in early Israel in a time like the time of the Exodus, or in a time like David lived, or in a time like Solomon lived. Yes, someone could have written a text. We don't have a ton of evidence of it from within Israel itself, but we have at least the beginnings of evidence that writing was there, and there could have been a scribal apparatus that produced much nicer texts than these. Certainly these can't be the only people that knew how to write, and we just happened to discover 4 of their little fragmentary things. There must have been some bigger literacy phenomenon going on. What it produced and when, still a mystery to us though, okay? Yes, and when you look at Solomon, I'm sneaking some archaeology in here. I said I was just going to do writing and text here, but I'm going to sneak in some archaeology. Just to say, I mean, when you look at even something like this, these are all archaeological plans for city gates at locations like Gezer, Hazor, Ashdod, Lachish, and Megiddo. Some of these places are places actually that the book of Kings, 1 Kings 9 in particular, says that Solomon built and did some kind of royal building program. Well, many archaeologists have looked at these types of remains and said, you know, the fact that all these are so similar, do you see the similarities in these city gate structures at these places, could suggest something like a centralized royally planned building program. In other words, people just didn't coincidentally build really sophisticated gate structures for their cities by accident. Something that was planned. Could you correlate this with the reference to some of these same places and Solomon's building activity in 1 Kings 9? Maybe. It's suggestive. It doesn't really prove anything for sure. But the idea that, you know, something like that, a reference like that in 1 Kings 9 would be impossible and we have no evidence of it. Well, no, it's not impossible. And we do have evidence in things like this. Just a quick reference to something like that. Okay. All right, more inscriptions. Did Israel exist outside the Bible? How about this thing? This is called the Mesha inscription, or the Moabite stone, or something like that. The date here is not totally clear. I think it might be from the 830s BCE. Something like that. And this King Mesha was a king of Moab, a country bordering on Israel. He mentions Israel here in this stela from the 9th century. And he mentions Israel, he mentions going to war with Israel. He mentions doing various kinds of things, okay, but he does mention Israel. It would be pretty weird if he just invented Israel, or if he was also participating in the cover-up that Israel was never real. And so on. So this, we don't have, and by the way, now, it's the point in the video deep in here where I should mention, you'd think that we would have an inscription like this from an Israelite king. Why do we have one from a Moabite king, Mesha? Do we have one from like King David or Solomon or even Hezekiah? No, we do not. And that is a tragedy, my friends. Maybe one will be discovered, who knows? But we do not have a big royal inscription or a royal inscription of any kind from any Israelite king. I know that's disappointing for those looking for historicity and trying to support the historicity of the biblical text, but we have to just start where we are and admit what we have and what we don't have. What we do not have is a text like this from an Israelite king, but we have this thing from the 800s BCE, which at least does mention Israel, and is an example of the kind of thing a king of a smaller kingdom in the region, maybe like Israel or Judah, could have and did in fact do. How about this? This is called famously the Tel Dan Stele. The Tel Dan Stele. It's a piece of broken rock and it's written in Aramaic. It is from the Arameans. It's from a king named Hazael. It's a king that we find actually in the Bible, in the book of 2 Kings, chapters 8 through 9. It seems to maybe date from the 800s BC, maybe the early 700s, unclear. This is a really important artifact. I wish I had a better picture of it here. It's just printed out like in this tiny square. But basically what is so fascinating about this artifact is that it is the earliest reference to David in all of literature or inscription. The king here says, and I did this, and I did this, and I defeated this person, and da-da-da-da, and I defeated this person from the Beit, what in Hebrew you'd call the Beit David. And you can see the letters there very clearly, B-Y-T, D-Y-D in Aramaic, the house of David. What does this suggest then, or what does this prove? That everything that David did and said was historical and so on? No, not at all. It does prove that by maybe around the year 800, though, David was a known name and had established a house or a royal line in Israel. Okay? So that's pretty impressive. Like, this is something, if you care about the Bible as history and you want to support it, this is something that's good to know about. The Merneptah Stele, you got to have that in your pocket, and you got to have the Tel Dan Stele of Hazael in your pocket, literally in your pocket, ready to just pull out and show the haters at any moment, okay? What about some other things? Well, the Assyrians were a major empire in the ancient Near Eastern world, and they actually made a lot of inscriptions. They mentioned several Israelite kings, particularly Israelite kings from the north, particularly in the 800s BCE, when they were doing a lot of campaigning and so on. So this, a very early reference, maybe even the earliest reference to an Israelite king by name, I think it is actually. This is the monolith inscription of Shalmaneser III. Look at him there, that's Shalmaneser, okay? He mentions a king named Ahab, whom we find in the book of 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 16, for example. This is who Elijah has his battles with, Ahab and Jezebel. And he mentions, this is probably from the year 852 BC, he mentions Ahab in the context of a battle called the Battle of Karkar, which occurred in the year 853 BCE. And in fact, he mentions Ahab as having a pretty formidable army of chariots and horses and warriors that came to fight the Assyrians as part of this coalition. This whole thing is covered in, you can't really see it here on the video very well. Oh, maybe if I hold it close enough you can. Not quite. It's covered in this little chicken scratchy writing that we know as cuneiform in Akkadian, in the Assyrian language, the Assyrian dialect of Akkadian. So you have that. You also have this thing. Oh, I love this thing. This thing is cool. I'll tell you why. This is referred to as the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser. Same Shalmaneser as before. This one from about 25 years later, though, from around 825 BCE. He describes many different things. You can see this in the British Museum. I once did a whirlwind tour of the British Museum. I think I saw this thing there. But in one of these registers, you can see that there are images on it, all kinds of people and kings doing things. I'll give you a close-up of one of these. This is a fascinating picture. In this image, really the only thing of its type from the ancient world, we see a king here bowing on the ground. See him bowing, and then he's bowing to this king. That guy that's bowing there is identified in the cuneiform writing that runs across the top. And that guy is called Jehu, son of Omri, Jehu. And Jehu was an Israelite king, whom you can read about in the book of 2 Kings. He goes running around the countryside, doing battle and doing various things for the Lord and so on. This is the only example of an Israelite king that's depicted iconographically as a picture from this kind of context in the ancient world, from about 825 BCE. So Jehu was a real person. He's mentioned outside the Bible. Even if you say, well, the Bible just made him up. Well, you can't say the Assyrians also colluded with the Bible and also made him up. Like that makes no sense, right? What about this thing? This is an inscription of another Assyrian king, Nirari III, from about 800 BCE. A little less interesting. He just mentions a king named Jehoash giving some tribute to him. Jehoash being a king mentioned in 2 Kings 11 through 12. We have a bunch of really fascinating materials then, and I'll take this only really to the end of 2 Kings. I mean, there are other materials too I could have mentioned. I know I've gone on a long time already. If you've stuck through this all, you must care a lot. I'll mention just a couple of the things that deal particularly with King Hezekiah. King Hezekiah reigned in the latter part of the 8th century and led Israel really through a very, very hard time in its history. When the Assyrians threatened, not only did they destroy the northern part of the country, but threatened to destroy the southern part of the country as well, but they did not do it. That Assyrian invasion is described in this thing called the Taylor prism. It's kind of uninteresting visually, but it's just like a prism with these flat sides covered in cuneiform writing. You can see some of the writing there. And here, this king, Sennacherib, actually brags about coming to Judah and surrounding Jerusalem. He says he imprisoned Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, and Hezekiah paid him off to leave. But crucially, and this is crucial, the Assyrians were not able to or didn't take the city, which does comport with the biblical account somewhat, and on other points it does not, that in fact the Assyrians were defeated in the biblical account and had to leave. Okay, tough historical problem there. Maybe we could talk about that another time. Hezekiah also apparently made, I said there were no inscriptions from Israelite kings. Here's maybe the one exception. It's called the Hezekiah tunnel inscription or the Siloam tunnel inscription. This is a tunnel you can go into in Israel. I've walked through it. It's really fun to walk through. Apparently Hezekiah had workers who actually dug out this tunnel to help provide water during a time of siege from, you guessed it, the Assyrians, or by the Assyrians. And this tunnel inscription, here's the photo and here's a drawing of the letters there so you can see what that ancient script looked like, narrates the process by which they made this tunnel, by which they dug it out, they broke through, and these waters were provided, okay? So it's pretty cool. This is a pretty cool inscription. And some people have even analyzed this as being something like a biblical type account. The style of narration is a style of Hebrew that we would recognize from the Bible and suggests, again, and this is crucial, that the Hebrew language wasn't something that was just invented like in the Persian period in the 500s and 400s or the Hellenistic period in the 300s, which was a very different style of Hebrew, which linguists can really distinguish from earlier types of Hebrew like this, okay? So that's great. The last thing I'll mention here, Hezekiah is one of the only kings that has his name mentioned in something that was maybe native to ancient Judah. Here you have a seal impression, or like there would be something carved on hard rock. You press it into clay. This picture is a little bigger than it would have been in real life. These are pretty small, like the size of a big coin or something like that. And what do you have on here? But you have the name of Hezekiah. This L here, do you see this little hook letter? That's the letter L, Le in Hebrew. Le, and this in Hebrew is Hezekiah. This is his name. Melech Yehud, or Yehudah, meaning Hezekiah, king of Judah. So this was discovered in 2015. So we do keep discovering things that can, and one suspects that if we were to discover more things, we'd discover the names of more kings. We would know more, okay? So that was quite a whirlwind tour. Indeed. But you can see here, what do we have and what do we not have? Let's review. Two extreme skeptics who would say, well, there never was any, these kings were all fake, they were all made up, David was made up, Hezekiah, they're not real, nobody dealt with them, it's just fake, 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 fake. Just stop, okay, just stop. The evidence is not perfect, but it's suggestive, and it's the beginning of something, I would say. It's the beginning of something, I would say, that's suggestive of a core historical narrative, that these kings were probably real people. They probably reigned and lived in something like the order that the Bible suggests that they did. Israel probably really was living in the land around 1200 and something BCE. Fine, we don't know how they got there. We can't totally confirm the Exodus story historically. Set that aside for a moment. The mere fact that the Egyptians are referring to a group they call Israel living in the land there is really something at an early date like that. So if you didn't know about that, that's just something that's helpful to know about, okay? Israel wasn't invented in the Persian period or the Hellenistic period, okay? A lot of the stories, in fact, that we find in the Bible wouldn't have even made sense to people living in those later time periods. They would contain names and stories that, if they were supposed to have some kind of propaganda or ideological meaning to people living in those later periods that they made up for the earlier periods, it's just really hard to see what that meaning is in most cases. Is it true, though, in a sense that each generation kind of has to re-represent and invent itself anew? Of course. And were the biblical authors living always during the time period about which they wrote? No, it seems like they weren't, right? So there's always a sense of persuasion in narrative and certainly in historiography. And the task is really to get in touch with what ancient historiography was like when we examine these stories. So the challenge I want to offer then in conclusion here, I know, 35 minutes, the challenge I want to offer is to extreme skeptics, to people just like ranting and raving and who haven't studied these materials at all. Just sit and listen. Read, okay? Read minimalists like read Philip Davies. Read it. I mean, this is good stuff. This is a good book. It's not even very long. You can see how thin it is. But also maybe try reading something like this too. Provan, Long, and Longman. Put these things in dialogue with each other. And I would suggest that too I would also suggest that approach to traditional Christian readers as well. Don't just get into an echo chamber and read something that just confirms, the things that you already believe. But also check out a book like this. I mean, it's a little bit dated at this point, but it's worth reading and it's worth thinking about these issues. What would any Christian reader, theologian, biblical scholar, what would she or he try to do to get it right? To get it right, okay? Devote yourself to that if that's something that you actually care about, okay? So the challenge on the one hand I offer then would be to extreme skeptics. Oh, there's no evidence that Israel exists outside the Bible. All these kings are fake. No, there is evidence. I showed you some things. I showed you the main things. And I think it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool if you like to know about this kind of stuff. The other challenge I would offer though on the other side is to those who would suggest that the evidence I've shown would tell us that 100% of the Bible is historically accurate, and this proves that the Bible is a 100% literal historical chronicle of just things that happened. Not even close. Not even close, okay? This search for history and this understanding of genre and how the Bible was written is a task that must go on, right? Showing that the Arameans knew there was a house of David around the year 800 BCE it inspires confidence. But confidence in what exactly? Well, the exploration has to continue, okay? You can search, but the bias to find what we're looking for, we have to admit, is very, very strong. Nevertheless, I hope this helps you to see at least some of the kinds of sources we have from outside the Bible, and for you to get just some basic lay of the land, basic introductory lay of the land of the debate about the basic historical structure of the Bible, and was Israel a thing in the ancient world outside the Bible? It was.